You hear the iron gate grind open behind you. Sunlight cuts across stone, and somewhere in the distance, 50,000 voices rise like thunder. Your wrists are raw beneath the rope. The guard doesn't look at your face. He never does. You're not a person here. You're inventory. The smell of blood and sand drifts through the corridor, and you realize with cold clarity that you've been brought to the place where mercy doesn't exist. The arena. And you're not here to watch. This is Rome, and what happened to women like her in the shadow of the Colosseum was never meant to be spoken aloud. Before we go deeper, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I'm genuinely amazed that a story this dark, buried for 2,000 years, still finds people across every continent searching for the truth. The year is 82 CE. The Flavian Amphitheater, what we now call the Colosseum, has just opened its gates to the public. Titus, the emperor, has declared 100 days of games to celebrate. The historians Suetonius and Cassius Dio recorded the spectacle. Thousands of animals slaughtered, gladiators dying in choreographed combat. And somewhere in the margins of those records, barely mentioned, are the women. Prisoners of war, captives from Judea, from the Germanic frontiers, from rebellions crushed across the empire. They arrived in chains. They were catalogued like livestock. And what the Romans did with them reveals a cruelty so systematic, so deeply woven into the fabric of daily life, that it challenges everything we think we know about civilization. The archives don't lie, the bones don't lie, and neither do the receipts. In 1936, archaeologists excavating beneath a villa in Herculaneum uncovered a wooden writing tablet. It was a bill of sale, dated to 62 CE, the item listed. A woman aged 19. Identified only as Expetania. Captured during the early campaigns in Britain. The price, 800 sesterces. Roughly the cost of a good horse. Beside her name, a single notation, suitable for domestic and reproductive service. That line, cold and bureaucratic, tells you everything. She wasn't bought for her skills as a cook or a weaver. She was bought because her body could produce more slaves. Children born to enslaved mothers inherited their mother's status under Roman law. Partus sequitur ventrum. The child follows the womb. It wasn't just a legal principle. It was a business model. The papyri collections from Oxyrhynchus in Egypt contain dozens of similar contracts. Women listed by age, origin, and fertility. Some entries include the number of previous births. Others note miscarriages. One chilling document from the 2nd century records a dispute between two owners over a woman who had died in childbirth. Not grief. A financial disagreement. She had been valued at 1,000 denarii, and the buyer demanded a refund because she hadn't yet produced a child. This wasn't an aberration. This was policy. When Josephus described the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE, he recorded that 97,000 Jews were taken captive. Most were sold. Women and children fetched lower prices than men, but moved faster through the markets. Slave traders knew the demand. Roman households needed labor. Brothels needed inventory. And the gladiatorial schools needed something else entirely. Because here's where the story takes a darker turn. Gladiators weren't just fighters, they were celebrities. Sex symbols. And the Lannistae, the trainers who owned them, understood that spectacle sold tickets. So they didn't just pit men against beasts. They staged executions, public humiliations, and sometimes they forced captive women into the arena. Not to fight, to be displayed. Tertullian, the Christian writer from the 2nd century, described a scene that haunted him. A woman, stripped and bound to a wooden frame, was paraded before the crowd during the midday executions, the lunchtime shows. When the serious gladiators rested and the audience wanted something to keep them entertained between main events. She wasn't there for combat. She was there to be seen, to be degraded. To remind everyone watching what happened to those who defied Rome. Cassius Dio recorded another incident under the reign of Nero. During a particularly extravagant set of games, the emperor ordered that captive women from the northern campaigns be dressed as mythological figures and placed in tableaux vivants, living paintings, Andromeda chained to the rock, Pasiphae, and the bull. The crowd understood the references. They also understood what they were really watching. Women from conquered peoples, stripped of identity, used as props in Rome's theater of dominance. The Colosseum's underground chambers, the Hypogeum, still bear the scars of this machinery. Archaeologists have mapped the corridors where prisoners were held. Narrow cells, no light. The stone walls contain graffiti, scratched by hands that knew they weren't leaving. Some of it is legible. Names, prayers. One inscription, found in a holding area near the animal pens, reads simply, Mater memento. Mother, remember me. It was written in Greek, likely by a woman taken during one of Rome's eastern campaigns. But the arena was only one destination. Most captive women never saw the Colosseum. They disappeared into the private economy of exploitation that ran through every Roman household like plumbing. The letters of Pliny the Younger, written in the early 2nd century, casually mention purchasing a young slave girl for household purposes. He doesn't elaborate. He doesn't need to. Everyone reading understood what household purposes meant. Sexual access was assumed. It wasn't even considered adultery. A man couldn't commit adultery with his own property. That was the logic. The jurist Gaius, writing around 160 CE, codified it in his Institutes. Slaves were race things. They had no legal personhood, no capacity to consent, no protection under the law, and the consequences were measured in bones. Bioarchaeologists examining skeletal remains from Roman-era cemeteries have identified a pattern. Women's remains, particularly those found in areas associated with servile populations, show markers of repeated childbirth at young ages, pelvic scarring, stress fractures, enamel hypoplasia, a sign of childhood malnutrition followed by repeated pregnancies. One study from a necropolis outside Londinium, Roman London, found that nearly 40% of women buried in the servile sector showed evidence of having given birth at least 3 times before the age of 25. These weren't family women raising children in stable homes. These were bodies used as factories. the skeletal evidence aligns with what the papyri tell us. In Roman Egypt, where dry conditions preserved thousands of documents, we have records of slave women being loaned out for breeding purposes. One contract from the late 1st century describes a woman named Thermion, age 16, who was leased to another household for reproductive service for a period of 2 years. The contract specifies that any children born during the lease would belong to the original owner. Thermion herself had no say. She was, in the eyes of the law, a tool. But tools sometimes break. Medical texts from the period reveal the other side of this system. Soranus of Ephesus, a Greek physician practicing in Rome during the 2nd century, wrote extensively on gynecology and obstetrics. His work is clinical, methodical. He describes treatments for prolapsed uteruses, infections following childbirth, and methods to terminate pregnancies. And buried in his case notes is a grim reality. Many of his patients were enslaved women. He notes that treatments for slaves were often cheaper, less thorough, because the economic calculation was simple. If the cost of care exceeded the woman's replacement value, she was left to recover or die on her own. One passage is particularly chilling. Soranus describes a procedure to induce labor in a woman who had been in obstructed labor for 2 days. He notes that the procedure was performed without anesthetic, as the patient was of servile status and sedation was deemed an unnecessary expense. She survived. The child did not. Soranus records the outcome with the same tone he uses to describe setting a broken bone. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was economics. And economics, in Rome, had a way of justifying anything. The truly insidious part is how deeply normalized it all was. Slavery wasn't a moral question in Rome. It was infrastructure. The poet Martial, writing in the late 1st century, made jokes about it. Epigrams about lecherous old men buying pretty slave girls. Punchlines that assumed the audience understood the setup. Juvenal, the satirist, mocked wealthy matrons who treated their slave women with cruelty. But his mockery wasn't about the institution itself. It was about excess. About women who were too cruel, not about the fact that they could be cruel at all. Even the moralists didn't question the foundation. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, wrote letters urging kind treatment of slaves. He argued that they were human beings deserving of respect, but he never called for abolition. He never suggested that owning another person was wrong. His advice was about self-control, about being a better master. The system itself was never in doubt. And the system had a way of erasing its own victims. When a slave died, there was no public record unless the owner chose to commemorate them. Most didn't. The cemeteries outside Rome are filled with unmarked graves. Archaeologists excavating these sites find bodies buried without goods, without inscriptions, without names. They can sometimes determine age and sex. They can identify trauma, but identity gone. One mass burial pit near Ostia, Rome's port city, contained the remains of 63 individuals, mostly women, mostly young. Carbon dating placed them in the late 1st century. No records explain who they were or how they died. The leading theory, based on the condition of the bones, is disease. possibly an outbreak in one of the port warehouses where enslaved workers were housed in close quarters. They died anonymously. They were buried anonymously. And for 2,000 years, they stayed that way. But some women left traces. In 1897, an inscription was discovered in the ruins of a villa near Pompeii. It was a funerary monument, small and modest, erected by a freedwoman named Fortunata. The inscription is brief. Chia names her former master, her years of service, and the fact that she had been manumitted at the age of 32. Chia. And then, in a line that breaks through the formality, it says, she bore 6 children. 3 survived. Fortunata paid for that monument herself. She wanted to be remembered, not as property, not as a commodity, but as a mother, as someone whose children mattered. We don't know what happened to those 3 children. We don't know if they were freed with her or if they remained enslaved. But Fortunata made sure that someone, someday, would know they existed. That's the paradox of the archive. For every Fortunata who left a name, there were thousands who didn't, and yet the system that oppressed them left its own evidence. The contracts, the price lists, the laws, the bones. The Romans documented their own cruelty with the same bureaucratic precision they used to build aqueducts. And in that documentation, we see the machinery of exploitation laid bare. One of the most revealing sources is the Digest, a massive compilation of Roman legal opinions assembled in the 6th century under Emperor Justinian. It preserves centuries of legal thought, and scattered throughout its 50 books are rulings about slaves, questions of ownership, questions of liability, questions about what happens when a master impregnates his own slave and then wants to sell her. The jurists debate not whether he has the right, but whether the child counts as part of the sale price or as a separate asset. Read that again. They weren't debating morality. They were debating accounting. And it wasn't just Roman men. Roman women owned slaves too, and some of them were just as ruthless. The historian Tacitus records a case from the reign of Nero. A wealthy woman named Pomponia Graecina was accused of cruelty after one of her slave women died under suspicious circumstances. The case went to trial. Pomponia argued that the woman had died of natural causes. The prosecution presented testimony from other slaves who described beatings, starvation, and confinement in a lightless cell. The verdict: Pomponia was acquitted. The slave's testimony wasn't legally admissible. Slaves couldn't testify against their owners unless they were tortured first, and torture tended to produce the answers the interrogator wanted. The woman who died was never named in the record, but the architecture of Roman houses tells us something that texts don't. Excavations of villas across the empire reveal a consistent pattern. The public spaces, atria and tablina, decorated with frescoes and mosaics. The private family quarters, spacious and comfortable. And then, tucked away in corners, near kitchens or storage rooms, tiny cells, barely large enough to lie down in. No windows. No decoration. These were the slave quarters. The people who cooked the meals, who cleaned the floors, who raised the children of the family, slept in spaces smaller than a modern closet. And some of those spaces contain evidence that still makes archaeologists pause. In one villa near Herculaneum, buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, researchers found a small locked room. Inside were the remains of a woman, age estimated at 16 to 18, and an infant. The door had been locked from the outside. The current theory is that she was confined there, possibly as punishment, and forgotten in the chaos of the eruption. The infant's remains were cradled in her arms. They died together, alone, in the dark. That discovery was made in 1982. The room is now part of the archaeological site. Visitors walk past it every day. Most don't notice. It's just another shadow in the ruins. But shadows are where the truth lives. Because for all the grandeur of Rome, for all the marble and the aqueducts and the philosophy, there was this: women whose names we'll never know. Children who never had a chance. Lives compressed into price tags and inventory lists. The empire ran on their backs, their labor, their bodies. And when they were used up, the system replaced them. The games at the Colosseum weren't an aberration. They were a display, a reminder. This is what happens to those who fall into Rome's hands. This is what power looks like when it has no limits. And the most horrifying part, they cheered. 50,000 people packed into the Colosseum, watching women degraded and killed, and they cheered. They bought snacks from vendors. They placed bets. They went home and told their families about the spectacle they'd seen. Because in Rome, cruelty wasn't hidden. It was entertainment. The archaeological record gives us the infrastructure. The texts give us the legal framework, but it's the small human details that cut the deepest. The graffiti scratched into a cell wall. The cheap bracelet found on a skeleton buried in a mass grave. The contract that lists a woman's scars as a way to verify her identity during a sale. These weren't monsters. They were people, and they suffered in ways that should never be forgotten. The Roman Empire fell. The Colosseum crumbled. The laws were rewritten, but the bones remain. The documents remain, and the question remains: how do we remember the people who weren't supposed to be remembered? Fortunata built herself a monument. But for every woman who could afford stone, 1,000 disappeared into the earth with nothing. Their stories exist only in fragments, a name in a ledger, a bone with a fracture, a room with a locked door. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the act of searching, of excavating, of reading those ledgers and studying those bones is its own kind of monument. A refusal to let the machinery of forgetting finish what the machinery of exploitation started. Because Rome wanted us to remember the emperors, the generals, the victories, the glory, but the women in the cells beneath the Colosseum, the ones whose names were never recorded, whose graves were never marked, they're the ones who tell the truth about what empire really costs. And the truth is this: civilization has always been built on the bodies of people no one wanted to see. The stone remembers, even when we try not to.